I'm a dinosaur, watching the asteroid climate change get larger and larger. I'm kind of hoping St. Paul's Chief Resilience Officer, Russ Stark, can lend me something more than an umbrella. Join us on Forum. Will I be squashed or saved? I'm Heyl. I do design build, principally residential remodeling. My company lives and dies by the proposition, something is beautiful if and only if it's sustainable. This program is the second in a three-piece arc inspired by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, released in August. The first third of the arc is about climate science. The second third is what St. Paul is doing about climate change. And the third is what individuals are doing. Bear with me. I want to start with two large handfuls of facts. The IPCC report was prepared by 234 scientists from 66 countries. They make clear that human influence has warmed the global climate at a rate that's unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. Quoting from the report, in 2019, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations were higher than at any time in the last 2 million years, and concentrations of methane and nitrous oxide were higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. Those three are all greenhouse gases which trap heat in the atmosphere and raise the overall average temperature. Global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over the last 2,000 years. For example, temperatures during the most recent decade, 2011 to 2020, exceed those of the most recent multi-century warm period around 6,500 years ago. Meanwhile, global mean sea level has risen faster than any time since 1900 than any preceding century in at least the last 3,000 years. The document shows that emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities are responsible for approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming between 1850 and 1900, and finds that averaged over the next 20 years, global temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating. That's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. As the global temperatures increase, weather events become more violent. When it's too warm, biological systems cease to function. Do we really need to run that experiment? And at the risk of breaking the camel's back, one more fact which may help part the clouds of gloom. From a recent Pew Research polling, people in 17 of the world's advanced economies were asked whether they were willing to make changes in how they live and work to attenuate the effects of climate change. And here it comes. 80% said that they were willing to change between some and a lot. My guest today is Russ Stark, Chief Resilience Officer for the City of St. Paul. Russ got his bachelor's from Swarthmore in political science and his master's from the University of Delaware in urban affairs and public policy. And because I like to draw lines between dots, two of my great aunts went to Swarthmore, and my parents met at UD. Russ represented St. Paul's Ward 4 in the City Council and has worked for nonprofits before that. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
I've never met a CRO. Would you walk us through one of your days?
Sure. So my days are filled with meetings, mostly about projects that we're in the midst of. in my role focusing on the city's climate action and sustainability portfolio. There are CROs who focus on a broader set of things, resilience being a big word and a broad topic. But Mayor Carter really has me focused in that climate and sustainability realm.
How many other cities of, say, St. Paul's size have a CRO?
Cities of St. Paul size or larger, I would guess somewhere in the vicinity of 50. There was a program, the 100 Resilient Cities, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation some years back that seeded a lot of those positions. St. Paul was never funded by that program,
Okay.
but Mayor Carter decided to create the position just on his own.
And for yourself, when did climate change become real? When did it seem this is going to happen?
For me personally, climate
Yeah.
change has been real for a long time because I've been kind of keeping up with the science. I think, as you said from that Pew poll, I think it's become real for almost everyone in a way in the last few years, in a way that maybe it hadn't been before, with all the fires and floods and obvious warming trends and just things being really different on the ground from a day-to-day weather perspective.
And thinking back, I mean, when you say you've been following the science for a while, was there a report that you read, something you saw on television, a film, something when you were younger that when you think back on it, the continental divide, this is my life before and this is my life after, anything that specific, or was it more a gradual process?
There was definitely a process there, but if there was a watershed moment for me, it was reading Bill McKibben's The End of Nature when I was in college, which was one of the early books about this topic that sort of laid out the stakes and how much we already knew. This is back in the early 90s about the topic.
And once again, looking for particulars, did you remember any particular passages or metaphors or argument or image that he presented that you said, yeah?
Honestly, the title encompasses it in a way, The End of Nature, and it really kind of draws you right in. What is he talking about, the end of nature? And climate change doesn't really threaten the nature in itself or its end. And I think for too long we talked about it as this thing that was a threat to the environment, to the natural world, rather than the thing that I think most of us actually care about even more than that, which is it's a threat to humanity. And I think first and foremost, it's that sort of existential threat to the way that humans live and the way that we've come to experience the planet that we're rightly focused on today.
And that just strikes me as I don't know how to describe it, but just the complete turnaround, the inversion of the perspective of once upon a time it was out there. And now, I don't know how real it is for Minnesota yet. I mean, I'm not a farmer, so I haven't had to deal with a lot of things, and I live in downtown St. Paul, high enough above the river that I don't particularly worry about flooding. But certainly people in California probably have a different view than they once had. People along the East Coast, people in Louisiana. Do you have any idea of what it would take to get more Minnesotans saying, I think I better take this seriously?
I think for the most part, Minnesotans are taking it seriously. I think there's good information to say that people in St. Paul and the state of Minnesota care about this issue a lot already. I think Minnesota's always prided itself on its natural beauty and lakes and all those sorts of things. And while climate change might not feel that noticeably real in St. Paul day to day to most people, it's already hitting the city's budget. The increased frequency of the flooding along the Mississippi has already shown up in our annual budgets in terms of the cleanup process, the preparation for the flooding, which is pretty involved. 2019, we had the longest duration flood along the Mississippi in the city's history. And the city outlaid about $4 million plus on both the preparation and cleanup. Some of that was reimbursed by the federal government through FEMA. But that's getting to the point where it's real impacts even on the city's budget. When we were out doing engagement around our climate action resilience plan a couple of years ago, people seemed quite ready to talk about this topic and interested in really helping the city kind of push forward on action. So I can't speak for the rest of the state, but I
Right.
think here in St. Paul, people are ready to go.
I'm just struck with the height of the river about a month ago versus in 2019 when so much of the walkway along the river was underwater.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've only lived here since 2016. I mean, I've lived in Minneapolis for years, but only lived here. And so that was the first time I ever saw the walkways underwater. So $4 million, that's significant money, gets people's attention. The Oxford English Dictionary defines resilience as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. St. Paul's Climate Action and Resilience Plan reframes the effort, the discussion, if climate change is over. Now the question is, how do I survive the periodic extreme climate events which will become more and more common? What do we do as a city to get ready? And now I'm about to ask you something difficult, because having looked at the report myself, or plan, I know how difficult what I'm about to ask is. But could you give us a thumbnail of the St. Paul Climate Action and Resilience Plan? As far as what's in it, what's covered, who it's directed to?
So the plan is really meant to be a guidebook for the city's work moving forward around both climate action and resilience. And I distinguish those two terms. Climate action, all the things that we're doing to reduce our own contribution to the problem of climate change, and resilience, all the things that we are doing and will need to do to prepare for those changes that are already baked in and that we're already experiencing. So at a high level, the plan sets two goals in terms of reducing the community-wide emissions of greenhouse gases in St. Paul. It commits the city to becoming a net zero greenhouse gas community by 2050 and a 50% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, both of which are consistent with the IPCC report's analysis of what needs to happen globally. And so at a high level, we're focused in on reducing our emissions and preparing for the change. And the report really is pretty evenly split between the two in terms of its content. But I would say more of our work to date is focused on the reducing our contributions side of the equation. Even though we've experienced those changes to our climate here in St. Paul already, and some of it's invisible, but among cities around the country, we're actually already experiencing some of the most extreme climate change of any place in the United States. It's just that the way it's showing up here so far is that our winters are warmer, and not a lot of Minnesotans and St. Paulites are complaining about a little bit warmer winters. But one of the things that that's doing to the city is it's increasing the frequency of the freeze-thaw cycle throughout the winter. And that's really tough on our infrastructure. So that is showing up in the condition of our roadways, for example.
Yes, the roadways, any concrete, any asphalt,
Absolutely.
any of those things. You used the term net zero a moment ago. Would you walk us through net zero?
Sure. So the idea is to get down to essentially no carbon emissions coming from the city of St. Paul by 2050. It's probably not realistic to have no carbon emissions coming from the city of St. Paul. And so to the degree that we still have some carbon emissions, we would be either sequestering carbon on the other side of the equation, meaning through plantings or other ways of bringing carbon back into the soil, or offsetting those emissions somehow. But essentially the goal is to get to the point where we're no longer relying on the burning of fossil fuels to run our city.
So we look at this plan, and the question becomes, what metrics will be used to guide us of, we just tried a whole series of things, and now how do we measure, are we going in a healthier direction? Or do we need to change something yet again because we're not going where we need to go, say, to get to net zero? What metrics are in the plans that would help us divine that?
Well, the sort of simplest metric is our actual carbon emissions, and we are doing an annual inventory of those every year with the best data that we have access to. We know that most of those emissions are coming from two sectors: the energy used in buildings and the energy used in transportation. And so we get pretty good data about sort of year to year how that's changing. I would say the other key metric for us and a key value in the plan is equity, and sort of the idea that we know that our lowest income communities and communities of color will be the most heavily impacted by the impacts of climate change. And so working to ensure that those communities actually also benefit from the solutions is a big part of what's baked into our approach.
You mentioned something that I was going to ask you in a moment, but I'll ask it now. What does the St. Paul Climate Justice Advisory Board do? Any examples yet of where some of their thinking has improved an initiative?
So I'll answer your question, but first I'll take a half a step back
Okay.
to the creation of the Climate Action Resilience Plan. It was during that process of engaging the community about the idea of a plan and then on the draft plan before we finalized it, where we got a lot of feedback from community members through community town halls and forums, online, email, etc. And one of the things we heard over and over again was, this is great, keep doing more of this, and how do we as community members stay engaged in the work? And with a particular focus on the equity component of the plan is what we heard from a lot of people about. And so we actually built into the final version of the plan the idea of creating this Climate Justice Advisory Board that would advise the mayor and the council, so the policymakers, on the best ways to create and implement policies and programs in this climate action resilience space. The CJAB, as we call it, just got up and running in February, so we're still a relatively new group, about 6 months of monthly meetings so far, and they have heard a lot of what we've done so far is kind of getting the group up to speed on current practices, the plan itself, et cetera. And they've just started to advise on a couple of policies that are in the works.
Any glimmers that you can share as far as where they seem to be inclined to go? Still too soon.
They are really, I think, focused in like a laser on the ways in which St. Paul can take climate action in a way that benefits those most impacted communities, as I was talking about. So how do we build in workforce and wealth creation opportunities into all of our strategies for getting down to net zero? How do we ensure that our policies and programs for making buildings more energy efficient and moving them off of fossil fuels are going after those who can least afford to pay high energy bills first? I would say that's sort of the leanings and the tendency of the group, which is exactly what we were wanting. But how we develop the specifics of those policies and programs can be key to their success and to how people receive them, and that's really why we're there, why they're there.
Now, I'm wondering if I got this correctly from the plan. Talking about transportation and picking up on people who lack resources. I mean, they simply don't have the resources. It seemed like the plan was, as far as transportation was going, almost inverted the status quo. That rather than having the car at the top of the heap, an auto-centric urban design, it's completely inverted to the pedestrian, that the person using public transit. Have I got that right as far as a general strategy?
You do, and both through the development of the Climate Action Plan as well as the city's comprehensive plan, which gets redone about every 10 years and has a transportation chapter, we developed sort of a hierarchy of approach to transportation where we said, let's focus on making transportation safest for the most vulnerable users. So who are the most vulnerable users in our streets out there? It starts with pedestrians, and then we go cyclists, and then transit riders, because of course you have to walk to transit. There's almost no other way to
Right.
use it, followed by other vehicles and cars. So yes, I would say we've flipped certainly the mid-20th century idea of transportation on its head in that, and really focusing in on the ways in which we can make it easier, safer, and more convenient for people to not have to own cars. It's not to say that we're anti-car in any way. It's to say that cities that people like to spend time in and like to live in are those where they don't have to get in the car. And so I think there's actually a good synergy between the places that people want to live and ways that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by making our community more walkable, more bikeable, easier to take transit in.
That's one of the reasons why I moved to downtown St. Paul, because I can walk to everything. I mean, groceries are 3 blocks away. Wine is a block and a half. 2 microbreweries are 2 blocks away. Takes me about 20 minutes to walk to the Ordway. Takes me about 15 minutes to walk to the river.
Absolutely.
But that was the reason why, one of the reasons why I decided to live here again. One of the things that intrigues me is the difference between when I was a child, highway technology, and what we have now. I just remember the machines compacting asphalt. But I watched Jackson Street get rebuilt to modern standards and was just impressed at the holistic approach of the space given for pedestrians, the space given for bicyclists, the resilient quality of the bicycling pavement, the on-site water runoff disposal, planning for future communications by putting in larger conduit under the street than what's required. It just, and so, I mean, to me, this is the part that's so hard, is it takes so long for old structure like that to be replaced, and then the expense of it. And then, as you say, in Minnesota, the freeze-thaw, which beats it up as soon as it's put in the ground. So, but anyway, just astonished at this is the manifestation of a set of values and ideals and aspirations, and here it is.
That's right, and I think Jackson's probably one of our better, or maybe even best example of sort of all of those values embodied in one street. We don't have the resources to reconstruct streets all the time, or as often as they might need it in some cases. And so we need to continue to use a variety of strategies to make those streets have some of those qualities that we want them to have before we get around to reconstructing them. And so in Mayor Carter's term here, we've made some changes that are relevant there. He created the first ever permanent funding source for adding bikeways around the community. It used to just be sort of one-offs and where the resources were available. Every time we resurface a street, which is less significant than a full reconstruction like on Jackson Street, but every time we resurface, we now also do an assessment for pedestrian safety needs, and we put in some of those features that can really make pedestrians feel more comfortable in that space, and safer. Because we know that for many decades, our streets were designed primarily with the idea in mind of moving cars through faster and more efficiently. And so it's a big change to kind of, as you said, turn that on its head and reprioritize.
So looking at the plan, now, do I understand that it was published in, November, December of 2019?
Yeah, that's right.
So you folks haven't even had 2 years to work with it yet, work on it, make it happen. Is there any part that you've been pleasantly surprised that has really moved faster in implementation than you anticipated? And is there any part that you thought would move quickly that is lagging?
Yes, both. We've had some good success with accelerating our work around energy efficiency in city-owned buildings, where we've created basically an internal loan fund using the city's treasury to loan departments money to make efficiency improvements in buildings, and then those loans are paid back through the energy savings. So this is primarily so far about switching out light bulbs in city buildings to LED. We're going that next step next in terms of looking at actually the heating and ventilation and cooling systems in buildings. That's going very well. We've made some significant strides in transportation. We are on the verge of launching a new electric vehicle charging network and electric vehicle car share program, partnering with our local nonprofit, Our Car, also based here in the Midway. And it will be, when it launches, it'll be one of the larger electric car share programs in the country. And part of the idea here is that, one, we do have to drive less to reduce emissions, but two, the driving that we do needs to increasingly be in electrically powered vehicles. And those vehicles aren't necessarily accessible to everyone yet in terms of personal ownership. And recognizing that, we really thought that if we were going to help prime the pump with charging to make it more possible for people to think about owning EVs, that we also had to make it more possible for people who can't afford an EV to be able to utilize that clean technology. And thus we came up with this idea working with Our Car of an EV car share program. So we're excited to launch that soon. It'll be a great piece of the puzzle. It's not for every trip, but it's sort of one of those things for you, for example, where you live downtown, you walk a lot. Occasionally, you're going to need that car to make a run, somewhere else that's not well served by transit or walking distance.
And finally, in your own life, what do you personally do as a response to climate change?
Yeah, if my wife were sitting here, she would roll her eyes because sometimes we do more than she appreciates. But we've for a long time been just very mindful of our own kind of household's carbon footprint, and try to drive as little as we need to, and that's certainly a big part of it. But also thinking about energy use. When the kids were little, we would have a little dish of nickels next to the light switch in their room. And every time they forgot to turn the light off, they lost a nickel.
Okay.
And so that was a pretty useful way of kind of getting the message across. There are those simple things we can do as individuals to reduce our own day-to-day footprint. And I think those are important. But when I talk to people about this issue, I think it's important to note that in order to move as fast as we need to with emissions reductions, individual behavior can't get us there. We've got to make these big changes at the level of systems, at the level of the type of energy that we use in our buildings, in our transportation systems.
Well, thank you. My guest today has been, excuse me, my guest today has been the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of St. Paul, Russ Stark. If you have any comments or ideas for future programs, you can post them on the Affirming Flame Facebook page. That's the Affirming Flame. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Heyl.